Hello and welcome to today's episode of pianoTV. I am Allysia, your host, and today we are going to talk about the music of Canada. We're going to look at the music of Canada in a historical context, mainly talking about the development of classical music from 1600 to 1900. We're not really going to touch on modern music because that's a whole other ballpark. That would be another really big video. We'll also briefly touch on music of Indigenous peoples and Celtic music and folk music, but we're not going to go into depth on those genres either, just again because they're huge topics and I want to be able to do them justice when we do bring them up on this channel. So without further ado, let's get started. Since Canada is a fairly new country, it didn't officially become a country until the year 1867, it doesn't have the rich tapestry of musical tradition in the way that European music does. When you're talking about classical music, that is. There is like a rich tradition of Indigenous music, but again, not the subject of today's video. Unfortunately, classical European music and Indigenous music didn't really intersect because the people who came over from Europe basically were like, nope, I don't care about your traditions. We're going to, pursue our traditions. So they were kept separate. They didn't really mix. Whereas what you would find a lot of the times in Europe is composers would be inspired by folk music. So you'd have people like Liszt who would take Hungarian folk tunes and make them into elaborate piano performances. But the people who migrated from Europe to Canada didn't do that. The main musical influencers in Canada's classical music history are people from Britain, Scotland, Ireland, and France, because those were the countries that people mainly immigrated from in the 1600s and onward. The United States also exerted its influence because it was Canada's direct neighbor, so there was some of that as well. We also don't have a lot of written records of Indigenous music, just because like a lot of folk music traditions, they were spread orally as opposed to written down, and because of that we don't really have the records of them. Another thing that hindered the spread of Indigenous music is just the fact that Europeans strongly encouraged Indigenous folk to stop practicing their ceremonies and stuff, which kind of killed that musical development. The earliest transcriptions of First Nations music is from 1606, transcribed by a Frenchman. The music was written by Henry Membertou, who was a Grand Chief in what is now known as Nova Scotia. These songs were written with 3 notes only, and they are traditionally performed on the Native American flute, although I will show you this tune briefly on the piano just so you can get an idea of what it was sounding like. The earliest settlements in Canada were in Quebec in the early 1600s. In Quebec City, which was the capital, and still is, the French and Aboriginal children were taught Western European music, everything from singing to playing violins to drums and trumpets and so on. The immigrants from France loved music, particularly dance and fiddle playing. While there weren't any world-class musicians from this time period, music was, and still is, considered extremely important to Canadian culture. One of the first important musicians in New France, Quebec, was Louis Jolliet. He was active in the mid to late 1600s and was a jack of all trades, like most musicians of the time. So not only did he play a variety of instruments like the keyboard, flute, trumpet, etc., but he was also an explorer and voyager. And that's actually what he's most well known for, is his travels. At a memorial in 1700, Jolliet was recognized as having played the organ in the cathedral and parish for many years, done without pay. And that's kind of how we know that he was a prominent musician of his time. In the 18th century, music became more prominent in Canada, and this was partly because of the British rule and the subsequent military band music, but also because there was just a big influx of immigrants arriving in Canada, and they brought their own traditions with them. There was plenty of political turbulence and war in the 1700s, which meant that a lot of Canadian music at the time served a military function, and music from this time isn't really well preserved either because it was so functional. Because of the wars, Canadian people didn't really have time to pursue music as a serious career. They had to split their focus between, say, being in the army and being a musician. And this really stunted the musical growth of Canadian music in the 1700s. Career musicians in this time period would have been exceedingly rare. And because you didn't really have career musicians, you didn't have people who were spending like all of their time on music and developing the same level of mastery that European composers at the same time were doing. Things started to change in the 1700s though, because the printing press arrived in Canada around 1750. And what this did is enable music to spread in different ways. So people might pick up a newspaper and read about a musical concert that they could go to, or music teachers or music stores would have a place to advertise their services. There was a small minority of people in Canada at the time who were able to actually afford to spend their time and money on musical pursuits like their European counterparts, because basically at this time, being able to play music was considered a luxury and the mark of a refined person, something that most people weren't afforded. In the late 1700s, concerts and dancing were common in Canada. Operas also began to appear homegrown at this time. Operas written in Canada as opposed to being imported from Europe. Canada's very first two operas were written around the turn of the 1800s by Joseph Quesnel, and they were Colas et Colonnettes and Lucas et Cécile. Concert programs from this time were also performing orchestra and chamber music by famous European composers like Handel, Bach, Haydn, and Mozart, among others. Just like in the 1700s, in the 1800s, it was still relatively rare to be a career musician. Either you were a part-time musician or you supplemented your performing and composing with doing other music-related jobs like teaching or, being a church organist. Another benefit of the printing press was the emergence of periodicals. Because since Canada is such a huge and sprawling country, immigrants who would come over to Canada would often feel really isolated and alienated from others from their culture. But what these periodicals did was connect people to the wider world in the same way that like picking up a newspaper or reading the news in some other form like the internet, I guess, which is more common now, connects us to the world as a whole and makes us feel like a part of something. The same thing was happening with immigrants. They were able to be connected to others, and this had a net positive benefit on music. These publications often provided printed sheet music that people at home would be able to play. One of the earliest surviving songs from such a publication was called The Merry Bells of England, written by J.F. Lemon from Ottawa, written in 1840. Let's take a quick listen. I'm just going to play a little bit on the piano so you can get a sense of the tune. Between 1815 and 1850, Canada once again saw another big influx of immigrants from the British Isles, and this again brought more culture with it to Canada. At this time, people were starting more music businesses, such as music stores that published and sold sheet music, and music stores that sold pianos, which was a relatively new instrument at the time. As time passed and the industrial era really started blooming, so did the Canadian middle class. And with this came more money and more time. More people were now able to consume music and enjoy it, whereas only the upper class had been able to do that before. Prominent musicians finally started appearing in Canada around this time, people that other people had actually heard of, such as the pianist Sigismund Thalberg, since people at this time now had more freedom to pursue music as a serious career. Music societies also started forming, as well as more and more musical stores, because the middle class was starting to crave the finer things in life. European music had distinct eras of development. We have the Baroque period, which moved to the classical period, then Romantic, and finally the modern period. And we've actually done on this channel videos of each of these eras if you want to get more in depth into the history of them. Canadian music followed the same path. The difference is with Canada. Since Canada is such a spread out and isolated country, and the people were basically alienated from European society, the music of Canada was never really innovative at this point. New developments drove music progress forward in Europe, but in Canada, the music sort of stagnated. There just wasn't the same pool of resources, and talent was too widespread, again, since Canada is huge. If you wanted to be a musician in the 1800s, you really had to be a jack of all trades. So not only would you have to be able to perform and compose, but you'd also have to be able to play more than one instrument, maybe be competent at teaching. You might even repair instruments, sell music, work part-time at a church, playing the keyboard, stuff like that. You need to be able to do it all. Most of the sheet music we have from this era today is largely functional music. So music that would be used for events or dances, things like that. Not the same kind of like elevated music that you were finding in Europe around the same time. Music would be written in a similar style. So say in the 1800s when Liszt and Chopin were really popular, composers in Canada would be writing in a similar vein, but it would be derivative. It didn't really ever become innovative at that point. In the late 1800s, music conservatories began popping up in Canada, which enabled more people to study music seriously. Music was also a serious subject in public schools. even though Canadian composers weren't necessarily innovators at this time, Canadians still saw the value in music education and still do. The most important conservatory to come about at this time in Canada was the Royal Conservatory of Music in Toronto, which was founded in 1886. One popular sacred song from this era was One Sweetly Solemn Thought. The text was written by a woman named Phoebe Carey and set to music by Robert Ambrose. This was made popular by touring evangelicals and is considered one of Canada's most famous tunes of the 19th century. So let's take a quick listen on the piano. Canadian musicians always looked towards European musicians for inspiration, and it wasn't really until the 20th century where Canada started solidifying its own unique identity in the musical landscape, largely in the pop music sphere. Folk music, just like dance music, was alive and well in Quebec in the 1700s and 1800s. The French musicians coming over from France were really fond of dancing and singing and playing the fiddle. Fiddles were actually the preferred instruments of the working class, and you would more than likely come across fiddle players if you were, say, going out to the bar for a night. One famous Canadian folk tune is called A Canadian Boat Song. We actually did a tutorial of this song on the channel way back in the day, so check it out if it's something you'd like to learn. I think it was right around a preparatory grade 1 level, so if you've been playing for, like 6 months or so, you should be able to play it, or at least attempt it, maybe closer to a year, depending. Anyway, let's take a quick listen to a piano excerpt of it so you can hear what it sounds like. Another popular Canadian genre, aside from classical and folk music, was Celtic music. This music traveled to Canada's east coast along with the Irish and Scottish. Celtic music is still common in Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and New Brunswick, which are the 4 eastern provinces in Canada. As I've mentioned throughout this video, Canadians were hugely fond of music, then and now, and especially of dancing. A Scottish traveler named George Heriot wrote, "The whole of the Canadian inhabitants are remarkably fond of dancing, and frequently amuse themselves at all seasons with that agreeable exercise." And that is all for today's brief tour through Canadian music history. Again, I kind of stopped around the 1900 mark because that's when things really start to change with music. A whole bunch of new things started popping up. Pop music started becoming a thing, and etc. So we'll have to spend some time talking about that on the channel one day. For something that kind of comes close, we did do a video recently on blues music, and blues music is a genre that expanded through the 1900s. It's mainly focused in the United States, but check out that video if you do want a little bit of a glimpse into more modern music. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. Give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and you can hang out with us over on our social media channels, which you can find on the cards in the, following image scene thing. Catch you in the next video. Between 1815